The tragic story behind this 1887 wedding photo was hidden for over a century. The photograph arrived at the Boston Museum of Social History in February 2024, part of a larger estate donation from the descendants of the Ashford family. The collection included furniture, silverware, personal letters, and several dozen photographs documenting one of Boston's oldest banking families. Dr. James Mitchell, the museum's chief curator specializing in 19th century social history, had been cataloging the materials for 2 weeks when he came across the wedding portrait. It was a formal studio photograph, typical of the 1880s. A young couple stood before an elaborately painted backdrop featuring classical columns and draped velvet curtains. The woman wore a white wedding gown of extraordinary expense, layers of silk, lace, and tulle, with a high collar, fitted bodice, and a train that pooled at her feet. Her veil cascaded from a crown of orange blossoms. She held a large bouquet of white roses and lilies. The man beside her wore a black morning coat with tails, striped trousers, and a silk vest. His collar was starched white, his tie perfectly knotted. Everything about their attire spoke of wealth and social prominence. James studied the photograph with professional interest. Wedding portraits from this era were important historical documents, revealing details about fashion, social customs, and family status. This one was particularly well preserved. The image sharp and clear despite being nearly 140 years old, but something about the photograph troubled him. He couldn't immediately identify what it was, just a vague sense that something was wrong with the image. He set it aside and continued working through the other materials in the collection. Hours later, he returned to the wedding portrait. This time, he examined it more carefully, using his magnifying glass to study the details. And then he saw it. The bride's hands clutching the bouquet were not steady. Even in a photograph that required subjects to remain perfectly still for 30 seconds or more, her hands showed visible blur, a tremor so pronounced that the flowers appeared slightly out of focus while the rest of her body was sharp. James moved his examination to her face. Her expression, which he had initially taken for the typical solemn formality of Victorian portraits, now looked different. Her eyes were swollen and red-rimmed. Her jaw was clenched tight. This wasn't formal dignity. This was someone struggling to maintain composure. He looked at the groom. The man stood rigidly upright, his hands at his sides, not touching his bride. Victorian propriety might explain the lack of physical contact, but there was something else. His body was angled slightly away from her, as if creating distance. His gaze was fixed on something to the left of the camera, while hers looked right. They weren't looking at each other, weren't even looking in the same direction. James photographed the portrait with his high-resolution camera and uploaded it to his computer for digital enhancement. Under digital magnification, the troubling details became impossible to ignore. James started with the bride's face, enhancing the contrast and sharpness. Her eyes were definitely red and swollen, not just from the typical eye strain of looking at early photographic equipment, but from prolonged crying. He could see the puffiness around her eyelids, the redness in the whites of her eyes. Her lips were pressed together in a thin line, not the gentle closed-mouth expression typical of formal portraits. The muscles in her jaw were visibly tense, as if she was forcing herself not to cry or scream. There was a tightness around her eyes, a strain that suggested she was holding back intense emotion. James zoomed in on her hands gripping the bouquet. The blur was unmistakable now, a rapid tremor that the long exposure time had captured as ghostly movement. Her knuckles were white with the force of her grip. She wasn't holding the flowers gently for display, she was clutching them as if they were the only thing keeping her upright. He examined her posture more closely. Victorian wedding dresses were constructed with corsets and internal supports that held women rigidly upright, but even accounting for that, the bride's stance seemed unnaturally stiff. Her shoulders were raised slightly, tense. Her entire body conveyed rigid control, as if she was using every ounce of willpower to remain standing and composed. Moving to the groom, James noticed details he had missed before. The man's hands, hanging at his sides, were clenched into fists. His face, which had seemed merely stern at first glance, showed something closer to grim resignation. His eyes, looking away from his bride, had a hard, distant quality. Not the look of a man on his wedding day, but of someone enduring an unpleasant duty. The space between them was significant. In most wedding portraits of this era, couples stood close together, often with the groom's hand resting on the bride's arm or shoulder. But this couple had at least 6 inches of visible space between them. Neither touched the other. Neither even leaned slightly toward the other. They stood like strangers forced into proximity, maintaining as much distance as the photographic composition would allow. James examined the background details. The studio setting was expensive, a prestigious Boston photography establishment that catered to the city's elite. The props and backdrop indicated this was a first-class sitting, not a rushed or budget affair. Someone had paid significant money for this portrait, but despite the expensive setting and elaborate clothing, there was no joy in the image, no warmth, no connection between the two people who had presumably just been married. James found the photographer's mark in the corner of the print. Whitmore & Sons, Fine Photography, Tremont Street, Boston. He knew the studio. It had been one of Boston's most prestigious photographic establishments in the 1880s and 1890s. Their business records might provide additional context. On the back of the photograph, written in faded ink, was a notation. Mr. Edmund Ashford and Miss Catherine Morrison, married June 15, 1887. James began researching the Ashford and Morrison families. Both names were familiar to anyone who studied Boston's Gilded Age history. The Ashfords had been prominent bankers, one of the old money families that had shaped Boston's financial district. The Morrisons had been equally wealthy, their fortune built on shipping and maritime trade. He started with the 1880 census, taken 7 years before the wedding. Edmund Ashford was listed as age 21, living with his parents in a Beacon Hill mansion. His father, Richard Ashford, was described as a banker with significant real estate holdings. The household included Edmund, his parents, 2 younger sisters, and 8 servants. Catherine Morrison appeared in the 1880 census as age 14, living with her parents in an equally impressive Back Bay residence. Her father, Thomas Morrison, was listed as a shipping merchant. The household included Catherine, her parents, an older brother, and 6 servants. Both families were part of Boston's social elite, the class that summered in Newport, attended the best churches, and married within their own tight circle. A marriage between an Ashford and a Morrison would have been seen as appropriate, even advantageous, joining 2 wealthy and respected families. But James found something troubling in the Boston Social Register from 1886, 1 year before the wedding. Catherine Morrison was listed as engaged to a different man entirely. Mr. Philip Hartwell, described as the son of a respectable family of moderate means. James searched for more information about Philip Hartwell. He found him in the 1880 census, age 20, living with his widowed mother in a modest South End neighborhood. His occupation was listed as artist and drawing instructor. This was clearly not a family of wealth or prominence. What had happened between the 1886 engagement announcement and the June 1887 marriage to Edmund Ashford? Why had Catherine's engagement to Philip Hartwell been broken? And why had she instead married Edmund, a man she clearly, judging from the wedding photograph, did not want to marry? James searched Boston newspaper archives from 1886 and 1887, looking for any mention of the Morrison or Ashford families. Society pages from this era were typically discreet about scandals, but sometimes hints appeared in carefully worded announcements. He found a brief item from the Boston Evening Transcript, dated March 1887. The engagement of Miss Catherine Morrison to Mr. Philip Hartwell, previously announced, has been dissolved by mutual agreement. Miss Morrison's family wishes her well in her future endeavors. Mutual agreement was society page code for forced separation, and future endeavors suggested the family had plans for Catherine that didn't include Philip Hartwell. 3 months later, in June 1887, another announcement. Mr. Edmund Ashford and Miss Catherine Morrison were united in marriage on the 15th Instern at King's Chapel, with a reception following at the Morrison residence. The happy couple will reside in Boston. The happy couple. James looked again at the wedding photograph, at Catherine's tear-swollen eyes and trembling hands, at Edmund's rigid distance and clenched fists. There was nothing happy about this union. James needed to understand what had forced the dissolution of Catherine's engagement to Philip Hartwell. He turned to the Morrison family papers, which had been donated to the Massachusetts Historical Society decades earlier. The collection included business correspondence, household accounts, and personal letters. In Thomas Morrison's business files from 1886, James found evidence of financial trouble. Letters from creditors demanding payment, notices of loans coming due, correspondence with banks about extending credit. The Morrison shipping business, which had seemed so prosperous in the 1880 census, was apparently in serious financial difficulty by 1886. A letter from Thomas Morrison to his business partner, dated November 1886, was particularly revealing. The situation is more dire than I previously disclosed. We are facing bankruptcy unless we can secure significant capital within 6 months. The Liverpool contracts have fallen through, and the China trade has collapsed. We have debts of over $200,000 and insufficient assets to cover them. I am exploring all possible solutions to preserve the family's standing and avoid public disgrace. $200,000 in 1886 was an enormous sum, equivalent to millions in modern currency. The Morrison family was facing complete financial ruin. James found more letters that outlined Thomas Morrison's solution to his crisis. In December 1886, he had approached Richard Ashford, whose bank was one of his major creditors, with a proposal. The details weren't spelled out in the correspondence, but the implications were clear. Thomas offered his daughter Catherine in marriage to Richard's son Edmund in exchange for the Ashford Bank, forgiving the Morrison family's debts, and providing additional capital to save the shipping business. A letter from Richard Ashford to Thomas Morrison, dated January 1887, made the arrangement explicit. I have discussed your proposal with my son Edmund. While he had not previously contemplated marriage to your daughter, he recognizes the advantages of uniting our families. He has agreed to the arrangement. In exchange, Ashford and Sons Bank will forgive the current debts of Morrison Shipping Company totaling $187,000 and will provide an additional credit line of $50,000 to restore the business to solvency. The marriage should take place no later than June to allow sufficient time for proper announcement and preparation, while avoiding any suggestion of haste that might invite speculation. James sat back, feeling sick. Catherine had been sold. Her father had traded her like property to save his business and preserve his family's social standing, and Edmund, the groom, had agreed to marry a woman he didn't love as a business transaction to benefit his family's bank. But what about Catherine's feelings? What about Philip Hartwell, her actual chosen fiancé? James needed to find out what had happened when Catherine learned of her father's arrangement. James found Catherine's voice in a collection of letters preserved by her closest friend, a woman named Eleanor, who had lived in New York. After Eleanor's death in 1932, her children had donated her papers to the New York Historical Society, including decades of correspondence with Catherine. The letters from early 1887 were heartbreaking. In February 1887, Catherine wrote, "Dearest Eleanor, I must tell you what has happened, though I can barely write the words without my hand shaking. Father has informed me that my engagement to Philip is ended, not by my choice, but by his command. He says our family is in financial difficulty and that my duty is to marry Edmund Ashford, whose family's bank can save us from ruin. I protested, I begged, I wept. But Father says I am being selfish, that I am putting my own desires above the welfare of the entire family. Mother says nothing, only looks away when I plead with her for support." Another letter, dated March 1887. "Philip came to the house today demanding to see me. Father had the servants turn him away. I watched from my window as he stood in the street, calling my name. I wanted to run to him, to tell him I still love him, that this marriage to Edmund is not my choice, but I am a prisoner in my own home. Father has forbidden me from leaving without accompaniment. I have no money of my own, no means of independence. What can I do?" In April. "I met Edmund Ashford today for the first time since this arrangement was made. We had tea in our parlor, supervised by both our mothers. He was cold, formal. He made no pretense of affection. He spoke of the marriage as if it were a business contract he was obligated to fulfill. I tried to speak to him honestly, to ask if he truly wanted this union. He said what he wanted was irrelevant, that both of us have duties to our families that supersede personal preference. How can I marry a man who speaks to me with such coldness? How can I stand before God and promise to love someone who regards me as nothing more than a transaction? May 1887. I am with child, Eleanor, Philip's child. I discovered this week. I am terrified. What will happen when father learns? Will he still force this marriage to Edmund? Or will the scandal destroy everything regardless? I cannot bear to tell Philip. He would insist we run away together, but where could we go with no money, no prospects? I am trapped in a nightmare with no escape. James read the letter 3 times, his heart pounding. Catherine had been pregnant with Philip Hartwell's child when she was forced to marry Edmund Ashford. This wasn't just an arranged marriage. It was a desperate cover-up of a pregnancy that would have scandalized both families. The next letter, dated June 1st, revealed what happened next. Father knows. I do not know how he discovered my condition, but he confronted me yesterday. He was livid with rage such as I have never seen. He called me vile names I cannot repeat. He said I have destroyed the family's honor, that I am selfish and wicked. Then his rage turned cold and calculating. He said the marriage to Edmund must happen immediately, before my condition becomes visible. He has moved the date up to June 15th. He will tell Edmund the truth, that I carry another man's child, and demand he accept the marriage anyway in exchange for even more favorable financial terms. I am to be sold at an even steeper discount, damaged goods desperate for any buyer. James found Edmund Ashford's perspective in his personal correspondence, preserved in the family papers. A letter from Richard Ashford to his son Edmund, dated June 3, 1887, laid out the situation with brutal clarity. Edmund, Thomas Morrison has disclosed to me a complication regarding your upcoming marriage to his daughter. The girl is with child by her previous suitor, that Hartwell fellow. Morrison is beside himself and has offered significantly improved financial terms if you will still proceed with the marriage. I have calculated the numbers, and the revised arrangement would benefit our bank substantially. The Morrison debt forgiveness remains, but Morrison will additionally transfer title of 3 commercial properties in the financial district to you personally, valued at approximately $75,000. Furthermore, he will ensure that Catherine brings a dowry of $30,000 in government bonds. The letter continued. I understand this is distasteful. However, consider the practical aspects. Once married, you may handle the situation as you see fit. If the child is born and acknowledged as yours, no one need know its true parentage. If you prefer, the child can be sent away after birth to be raised elsewhere. Many families in similar circumstances have managed such arrangements discreetly. The financial benefits are substantial, and you would be free to maintain your own private arrangements after marriage, as many men of our class do. I leave the decision to you, but I strongly encourage you to proceed. This marriage, even under these circumstances, serves our family's interests. Edmund's response, written the same day, revealed a man caught between financial obligation and personal disgust. Father, I will proceed with the marriage as you recommend. I have no romantic illusions about matrimony. I always understood this to be a business arrangement. The girl's pregnancy complicates matters but does not fundamentally change the transaction's value. However, I want certain understandings clear. I will not pretend affection for a woman who has proven herself morally compromised. I will fulfill my legal obligations as a husband, but I will maintain separate quarters in whatever household we establish. The child, if it survives birth, will be sent away. I will not raise another man's offspring as my own. Once the marriage is accomplished and the financial transfers complete, Catherine may live as she chooses, provided she maintains public propriety. I expect the same freedom for myself. James felt anger rising as he read Edmund's cold calculation. Both fathers were treating Catherine as a commodity, a problem to be managed through financial transactions. Edmund wasn't even pretending to care about the woman he was about to marry. But James also noted something else in Edmund's letter, a barely concealed resentment. Edmund didn't want this marriage any more than Catherine did. He was being pressured by his father to accept a situation he found distasteful. Both bride and groom were trapped in an arrangement neither wanted, forced into it by their family's financial interests and social expectations. James found one more letter, this one from Catherine's mother, Anne Morrison, to her sister in Philadelphia. dated June 10th, 1887, just 5 days before the wedding. Dear sister, I am writing in deepest distress. Our Catherine is to be married on the 15th, and it is a tragedy unfolding. She weeps constantly, eats almost nothing, and has grown pale and thin. The circumstances are too shameful to explain in writing, but know that she is being forced into a loveless union to save our family from ruin. Thomas insists this is her duty, that her personal feelings are insignificant compared to the family's welfare. But I see what this is doing to her spirit. She is being destroyed, and I am powerless to help her. I wanted to write to you so that someone knows the truth of what is happening, even if it can never be spoken publicly. James searched for contemporary accounts of the wedding itself. Boston Society pages from June 1887 describe the ceremony in the typical glowing terms used for high society events. The Boston Globe's Society column from June 16, 1887. One of the season's most elegant weddings took place yesterday at King's Chapel, where Miss Catherine Morrison became Mrs. Edmund Ashford before a distinguished gathering of Boston's finest families. The bride wore an exquisite gown of white silk and French lace, with a cathedral train and a veil of Brussels lace secured by a crown of orange blossoms. She carried white roses and lilies. The groom was attended by his brother-in-law, Mr. James Whitmore, while the bride's cousin, Miss Sarah Morrison, served as maid of honor. Following the ceremony, a reception was held at the Morrison residence on Commonwealth Avenue, where over 200 guests celebrated the happy union. Happy union. The phrase mocked the reality James had uncovered. He found the church records for King's Chapel, which included the marriage certificate. Catherine Morrison, age 21, and Edmund Ashford, age 28, married June 15, 1887, by Reverend William Thatcher. Then James found something unexpected, a letter from the photographer Henry Whitmore to a colleague dated June 17, 1887. Whitmore and Sons had taken the wedding portrait, and Henry Whitmore had apparently been disturbed by what he witnessed. Dear Robert, I photographed the most distressing wedding portrait yesterday. The Ashford-Morrison union, which the papers are describing as a joyous society event, was anything but. I have photographed hundreds of wedding couples, and I have never seen two people more miserable. The bride was clearly in great distress, her eyes red from crying, her hands shaking so severely I feared she might drop her bouquet. The groom stood as far from her as the composition would allow and would not look at her. When I asked them to move closer together for a more intimate pose, both refused. The bride's mother was weeping in the corner of my studio. The groom's father stood watching with a hard expression, as if overseeing a business transaction rather than his son's wedding. The letter continued. I have learned in this profession not to ask questions about what I observe. People's private sorrows are their own business. But I felt compelled to document what I saw as honestly as possible. I did not try to hide the bride's distress or create false warmth between the couple. Let the photograph show the truth of what this marriage was. Not a union of love, but some kind of arrangement that brought joy to no one. Perhaps someday someone will look at this portrait and understand what I witnessed. James realized that the photographer had deliberately captured the couple's misery. Most photographers of that era would have coached subjects, repositioned them, worked to create an image of happiness regardless of reality. But Whitmore had chosen to document the truth, the trembling hands, the tear-stained face, the rigid distance between bride and groom. The photograph was an act of witnessing, of refusing to participate in the fiction that this was a joyous occasion. James traced what happened to Catherine and Edmund after the wedding. Census records showed them living at separate addresses within 2 years of marriage. The 1890 census listed Edmund Ashford at a Beacon Hill townhouse with 2 servants. Catherine was enumerated at a different address in Brookline, a smaller house, with 1 elderly housekeeper. James found no birth record for a child born to Catherine in late 1887 or early 1888. He searched hospital records, church baptismal records, and city vital statistics. Nothing. Either the pregnancy had ended in miscarriage, or a child had been born and immediately given away with no official record, a common practice for families desperate to hide illegitimate births. He found a clue in a letter from Catherine to Eleanor, dated October 1887. The ordeal is over. I lost the child in August. The doctor says it was the shock and strain of these past months. I should feel grief, I suppose, but I feel only numbness. That child was the last connection to Philip, to the life I might have had. Now even that is gone. I am married to a man who despises me, living in a house he has provided but never visits, with no purpose and no hope. I am 21 years old and my life is over. Another letter from December 1887. Edmund came to the house today, the first time since September. He came only to inform me that he has taken a mistress and will be maintaining a separate household with her. He said he wanted me to know so I would not embarrass myself or the family by making demands on his time or attention. He was cold, businesslike, as if discussing a property matter. I told him I had no such expectations. What purpose would demanding his presence serve? He does not love me. I do not love him. We are legally bound but utterly separate in every meaningful way. James found evidence of Edmund's separate life in society gossip columns and private correspondence. He maintained a long-time relationship with a woman named Victoria, whom he supported financially and visited regularly. Their arrangement was discreet but not entirely secret. Within Boston's upper-class circles, such arrangements were common and generally tolerated as long as public propriety was maintained. Catherine, meanwhile, lived in increasing isolation. Letters to Eleanor revealed her struggles with depression, her sense of being trapped in a life that felt like a living death. I think often of what my life might have been if Father had not traded me to save his business, she wrote in 1890. Philip and I could have been happy, even if poor. We could have had children, a real marriage based on love rather than financial expedience. Instead, I am legally married but utterly alone, bound to a man who will not even speak to me, except when business requires it. James found one particularly poignant letter from 1895. I saw Philip today, quite by chance, on Tremont Street. He has married and has 3 children now. He looked happy, Eleanor. He has built the life of an artist and teacher that he always wanted. When he saw me, his face filled with such sadness. We spoke briefly, awkward, painful conversation. He asked if I was well. I lied and said yes. What else could I say? That I think of him every day. That I have spent 8 years trapped in a marriage that destroyed both Edmund and myself. He deserved better than to carry that burden of knowledge. James traced Catherine's life forward through the remaining years. She never had children, never reconciled with Edmund, and lived in increasingly poor health. Medical records from the 1890s and early 1900s found in family papers showed repeated treatments for nervous exhaustion and melancholia, 19th century terms for depression. A letter from Catherine's doctor to Edmund, dated 1902, recommended that Catherine be sent to a rest-cure facility, a common treatment for wealthy women suffering from mental health issues. Mrs. Ashford's condition has deteriorated significantly, the doctor wrote. She experiences periods of deep melancholy, refuses food, and speaks of wishing not to continue living. A period of rest and isolation under medical supervision may be beneficial. Edmund's response was brief and cold. Do whatever is necessary. Send the bills to my office. Catherine spent 6 months at a private sanitarium in western Massachusetts, returning to Boston in early 1903 no better than when she had left. Through letters to Eleanor, James learned that Catherine had found some purpose in charitable work. She became involved with organizations supporting young women in difficult circumstances, unwed mothers, women fleeing abusive situations, girls from poor families seeking education and employment. Her letters from this period showed a woman channeling her own suffering into helping others. I cannot undo what was done to me, she wrote to Eleanor in 1905. But perhaps I can prevent other women from being sold by their families as I was. I work with girls who have made mistakes, as society calls them. Girls who are pregnant and unmarried. Girls who have defied their families' plans for them. I help them find places to go, ways to support themselves, options other than forced marriages or desperate situations. If my own tragedy can give me understanding to help others, perhaps it was not entirely without purpose. James found records of Catherine's charitable work in the archives of several Boston women's organizations. She had quietly funded a home for unwed mothers, supported a vocational school for working-class girls, and provided financial assistance to women seeking to leave abusive marriages. She did this work largely anonymously, not seeking recognition or social credit. Edmund, meanwhile, continued his separate life. He succeeded his father as president of Ashford & Sons Bank in 1899. He maintained his relationship with Victoria, who lived in a house he purchased for her in Cambridge. They never married. He was already legally bound to Catherine, but they lived as a couple in all but name. Society tolerated the arrangement, and Edmund's business reputation remained intact. Catherine died on March 15, 1918, at age 52. Her death certificate listed the cause as influenza, part of the pandemic that swept through Boston that winter. But a letter from Eleanor to another friend, written after Catherine's death, suggested a different truth. Catherine had no will to fight the illness. She told me once that she had been waiting to die since she was 21 years old, since the day she was forced to marry Edmund. The influenza simply gave her permission to let go. Edmund died 7 years later in 1925, at age 66. The cause was listed as liver disease, likely the result of years of heavy drinking. He never remarried after Catherine's death, never legitimized his relationship with Victoria. He was buried in the Ashford family plot at Mount Auburn Cemetery. Catherine was buried separately in the Morrison family plot. In death, as in life, they remained apart. James spent 6 months developing an exhibition around the wedding photograph and the story it concealed. He titled it, "The Price of Propriety, Forced Marriage in Gilded Age Boston." The exhibition would use Catherine and Edmund's story to illuminate a broader pattern of women being traded as commodities to solve families' financial problems or social dilemmas. The wedding photograph was the centerpiece, displayed large enough for visitors to see every detail. Catherine's trembling hands, her red-rimmed eyes, the rigid distance between bride and groom. Accompanying text explained what the image showed: not a celebration, but a tragedy; not a union, but a transaction. James included the letters, the financial records, the evidence of Catherine's pregnancy and subsequent miscarriage, Edmund's cold response, and the documentation of their separate, miserable lives. He contextualized their story within the broader social and economic forces of the Gilded Age. The pressure on wealthy families to maintain their status, the treatment of women as property to be traded, the prioritizing of financial interests over human happiness. The exhibition opened in November 2024. Media coverage was extensive. The photograph itself was striking, a beautiful bride in an elaborate gown, looking utterly devastated. The contrast between the surface appearance of wealth and propriety and the underlying reality of coercion and suffering made for powerful storytelling. The exhibition drew visitors from across New England and beyond. Many were descendants of Gilded Age families, coming to confront uncomfortable truths about how their ancestors had treated women. James watched as women stood before Catherine's photograph, reading her letters, seeing their own experiences reflected in a story from 137 years ago. One visitor, an elderly woman named Margaret, approached James during the exhibition's third week. "My grandmother was married in 1892 to a man she'd never met," Margaret said quietly. "Her father had lost money in bad investments and arranged the marriage to clear his debts. She told me about it once, when I was young. She said her wedding day was the worst day of her life. I never really understood what she meant until I saw this exhibition. Now I do." James had included a section on the continuation of such practices. While outright forced marriages became less common after the early 20th century, economic marriages, unions arranged primarily for financial benefit rather than love, continued. The exhibition showed how women's economic dependence on men, their lack of property rights, and social expectations about marriage created conditions where true choice was often impossible. The exhibition sparked academic interest. Historians began researching similar cases, finding dozens of other forced marriages concealed behind proper society wedding announcements. Genealogists discovered stories in their own family trees, grandmothers and great-grandmothers who had been traded to solve financial problems, women who had lived entire lives in loveless marriages they never chose. 6 months after the opening, James organized a symposium bringing together historians, women's rights scholars, and descendants of families affected by forced marriages. They discussed the long-term impacts of treating women as property, the trauma that cascaded through generations, and the ways economic dependence continued to limit women's choices even in the 21st century. The Ashford and Morrison family descendants issued a joint statement acknowledging what had been done to Catherine. "We cannot undo the harm our ancestors inflicted," the statement read. "We can only acknowledge it, learn from it, and commit to ensuring that women's autonomy and dignity are respected. We are establishing a fund in Catherine Morrison Ashford's name to support organizations helping women escape forced marriages and financial coercion." James continued his research, but he always returned to that wedding photograph. Henry Whitmore, the photographer, had been right to document the truth rather than create a comforting fiction. The image had survived 137 years, carrying Catherine's pain forward through time, waiting for someone to notice, to investigate, to tell her story. One day, a young woman approached James in the museum. She was perhaps 25, engaged to be married. "I saw the exhibition," she said. "I saw Catherine's photograph. And I realized I need to be honest about something. My parents want me to marry someone from their social circle, someone they think is appropriate, but I don't love him. I've been going along with it because I didn't want to disappoint them. But seeing what happened to Catherine, seeing how her entire life was destroyed because she couldn't say no, I realize I have a choice she didn't have. I can walk away, and I'm going to." James smiled, feeling emotion tighten his throat. "Catherine would be glad to know her story helped you." The wedding photograph no longer concealed its tragedy. The trembling hands, the tear-swollen eyes, the rigid distance between bride and groom, all of it testified to a truth that had been hidden for over a century. Catherine Morrison had been sold to save her father's business and reputation. Edmund Ashford had been pressured into a marriage he didn't want to benefit his family's bank. Both had spent decades trapped in a legal bond that brought neither of them anything but misery. But now, 137 years after that photograph was taken, Catherine's suffering had found meaning. Her story was teaching new generations about the cost of treating people as property, about the importance of choice and autonomy, about the long shadows cast by injustice even when it's dressed in white lace and formal ceremony. The photograph remained on display, a beautiful image concealing a heartbreaking truth, a reminder that not all tragedies announce themselves loudly, that sometimes the deepest suffering hides behind the most proper facades, and that the past, if we look closely enough, still has urgent lessons to teach us about dignity, choice, and the human cost of valuing money and status over love and freedom.